Welcome everybody to Camberley Chess Club's weekly online meeting. We've been doing these meetings now since March last year. This is our 53rd meeting, and we've had all sorts of different meetings, from talks on openings, games, puzzles, consultation matches, as well as special events like this evening. We've had various people on, like Cyrus and Andrew Martin, and today, of course, we've got our star guest, who I'll introduce in a moment. To cover the costs of these meetings, we do have an online membership subscription, which I know most of you have signed up for. It's only £10, so that just keeps things ticking over. So if you haven't signed up for that, you can do so at a later date on our website, camberleychess.co.uk. So today we have a special guest, and I think all of us at Camberley Chess Club are very pleased to announce a Grandmaster, long-time UK #1, Michael Adams, and he's going to take us through a couple of games. I think first of all one game, and then we'll probably have a short break for a couple of minutes, and then have some questions and answers, and then take us through another game after that. So without further ado, please welcome Michael Adams.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Let me just make sure you can actually see my screen. Can everyone see the board now? Yep, okay, so yep. That's all good. Yep. So I'm not quite sure how it's going to work, if people are going to make comments as we go along. I'm probably not going to monitor the chat too much as we're going along, but if anyone wants to raise stuff in the chat as we go along, or bring it to my attention, that's fine. I'm actually going to show a couple of games this evening, or at least starting with one, quite old games actually, which I've just happened to have been looking at recently, and perhaps looking at them with modern computers, but going back and looking at them with fresh eyes. But a couple of games that are one that I was quite happy with. There are a couple of common features perhaps with the bishop pair in both of them, but some other points. The first game is quite complicated in many respects, and it's quite long, so I'll try and have a lot of comments and not bombard you with too many variations, but there certainly will be some. But it's I think it's a blend of strategy and tactics, so perhaps hopefully there'll be something for everyone to take out of it. And it's actually a game against Anatoly Karpov from Dortmund 1994. It was played in the first round. So at that time, Karpov was still very, very strong, and much stronger than me. In fact, looking at the ratings, he was rated 65 points higher at the time. So I'll just start making a few of the moves, and then I'll tell you a bit more about the game as we move along. I was playing whoops. I'm not. Yep, there we go. I was playing white in this game, and he played the Caro-Kann. At that time, that was pretty much his main defense. And we continued with knight d2. Again, at that time, knight d7 was actually one of the most popular lines, and it was also a line that I used to play quite a lot myself with black at that time, and quite a few other English players did as well, although Karpov was clearly the leading expert on that. I mean, it's interesting now that knight d7 is not a line which is seen very much. The knight f6 is trendy. Knight f6, there's a lot of attention coming to at the moment, taking with the e-pawn, and bishop f5 as well, but you don't see knight d7 so much. So I went for knight f3. It's not perhaps considered the most critical line these days, but I think it's quite logical, and the way white plays is very simple and straightforward. I should perhaps say a little bit about the preparation for the game, because Dortmund is a slightly unusual tournament in that they, at some stage, they started to bring the pairings out in advance, several months in advance of the tournament. And they'd actually done this for this event as well. I wasn't really aware of this. I think the previous time I played in Dortmund, it wasn't the case. And I remember at the opening ceremony, I was sitting next to Jan Timman, and it was a very nice meal. We were having some wine. Everything was going well. And things were getting quite late. And I said to Jan, well, won't they be doing the drawing of lots soon? And Jan said, well, didn't you get this information several months ago? And I was like, well, no, not really. And then he sort of picked up the menu, and he in fact, they had even printed the pairings on the back of the menu. So this was the first moment when I discovered that I was playing Karpov in the first round. So it wasn't an intensive plan, but strangely, actually, in this game, I had very good preparation. I got in a huge number of moves, and I also got quite a nice position. But this was mainly because my previous event had been the PCA candidates in New York, where I played a match against Tiviakov. And in a couple of our games, he had actually played the system, which I decided to try from the white side here. It's often not a bad idea if it's possible and a system is giving you trouble with one color, to maybe try it from the other side of the board, get a different perspective. So that was actually how I came to this opening system, but we'll see more about that later. We'll just let the game continue a bit. So knight f6. So the idea of this is knight g3. Is just to try and say black's a little bit cramped and to try and keep more material on the board. So this all finished. This all continued in the same way as my game with Tiviakov for quite a while, but they're all quite logical moves. e6, bishop d3, c5, challenging the pawn on d4, white castles. In one of the earlier games against Tiviakov, I had actually taken on d4 and played bishop c5. But after knight b3, this isn't so straightforward for black. He doesn't really want to give up the bishop. If the bishop drops back to b6, it prevents black from playing the b6, bishop b7 development he'd most like. In the game, I'd actually dropped the bishop back here, and he had gone rook e1, castles, and queen f3. And I actually won this first game of the match, but it was a bit unpleasant. It's not so easy for black to develop the queen side here. But anyway, that's a different way to play. I won't talk too much about the opening moves. We'll just move on to the middle game. So Karpov instead played bishop e7, just continuing to develop. Again, quite a logical move by white, queen e2, with the idea that after castles, rook d1, and just to threat it. So play down d-file, black queen gets out of the way. And now white plays c4. And this move also creates a little bit of a problem for black, because if he plays the most logical move that he would like to play, b6, problem is d5. It might look as though initially that black could play e takes d5, queen takes e7, rook e8 and trap the queen, but it doesn't actually work out that way, as bishop takes h7 check forces black to give the queen a way out. So this d5 is very favourable for white. So this is a little bit annoying for black. Karpov actually had this position before in quite a famous game against Kasparov, where he played c takes d4. That's also quite an interesting game that you might want to have a look at if you get the opportunity. I think Kasparov's notes for that game are quite interesting. But it looks a little bit dangerous to take on d4. After white takes back on d4, there's always some possibilities of knight takes e6, knight takes f5. And in fact, later on, Kasparov did sacrifice on e6 in that game. It wasn't completely sound, but it did result in a win for white in the end. So Karpov actually played a more cautious move, same move that I actually played in the game, rook e8, just protecting the bishop to take away the d5 possibility, figuring if black gets to play b6, bishop b7, it's a fairly comfortable position for white. White needs to find a way to redeploy this knight at some stage, otherwise it's going to end up a little bit passive here. But there's another way to keep the initiative going, which is to take on c5. And Karpov took back with a knight. It's also possible to take with a bishop. but that gives white some possibilities, maybe immediately to bring the knight back into the center with gain of time, or perhaps to play an idea a bit similar to the one in the game, and then perhaps another knight can come to the e4 square later, or even perhaps a knight h5 idea. Some possibilities. The advantage of taking with the knight is that it threatens to take the strong bishop on d3, which I chose to drop back to c2. Again, it looks logical to play b6 here, but here there's also still a slight problem with this move, in that white has a rather strong continuation to play knight e5, and after bishop b7, then bishop f4. There's some threats of knight g6. Again, white might also have ideas to play knight h5 later on, which would also protect this bishop, open up more possibilities on the king side. So this is not very promising for black. So again, black has to play a little bit more cautiously. So you can see already that the system has a little bit more poison than it looks for white. Perhaps that black is already having to make some reasonably accurate moves, which was to drop the knight back to d7, just to prevent this knight e5 idea. It also kind of reconnects the two knights on d7 f6. So gives black quite a solid position. So white has to look for some new ideas. And I played knight g5. This is again still following the way that Tiviakov played against me. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to throw in any questions, but if anyone's got a suggestion for how white should play against b6, would anyone have an idea here?
What about bishop takes h7? No.
Well, you said
yeah, possibly.
Bishop takes h7. Well, okay, let's take a look at knight takes h7. Let's just continue this line a little bit. Can we see an idea for white here?
Queen e4.
Yeah, queen e4, because basically the problem for black here is that the rook on e8 is not defended. So after the rook is taken on a8. So again, it's another slightly tricky line. I mean, actually, in the game that I was playing black against Tiviakov, it was actually the first rapid game. So it was, I think, a 25-minute game, maybe with an increment. So this was actually quite tricky stuff to be facing in a rapid game. Well, Karpov and me actually both chose the same move, which I think is perhaps actually a little bit excessively cautious. We both went knight f8. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But I think actually perhaps the most simple way for black to play is simply h6 here. Knight takes e6 isn't really dangerous here because, well, black's king can go either to h8. I think he can possibly also go to f8. But there's going to be a knight move either to f8 or to e5 with a discovered attack on the queen. There isn't really that much of a threat. So white should just drop the knight back to e4. And then I think black probably can play b6 without too many problems here. Something like b3 the game might continue. Something like this. And I think black's got quite a harmonious position here. I think this was perhaps a more practical way to play. Knight f8 isn't really bad, but it's maybe a little bit cautious and doesn't make it so easy for black to continually naturally. So I continued with knight e4, looking to exchange this knight on e4. And now that the knight isn't on d7 to support the knight, the fact that I can maybe exchange later on, bring the other knight back to e4, looks like a promising idea. So here Karpov actually played the same move that I did, to go bishop d7. I think it probably is possible to play knight takes e4 here, queen takes e4, but now black has to play f5, which I think looks, for a human, rather weakening and a bit ugly structure-wise. The computer thinks that maybe it works okay, and the knight on f8 can be useful there, but I think is not a very human line. But there is a concrete problem with the move in the game, in that after knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen d3, it's not so easy to defend h7 here. If g6, knight e4, bishop e5, something like bishop g5, even though his pawn is hanging, is not really important. There's going to be a knight f6 and really big problems for black on the weakened light squares. So there isn't really if h6, white can even put the knight into h7 in any event. So black has to actually capture on g5 and give up the bishop pair. So this, I think, gives white a small advantage, but quite a useful advantage. I mean, white has the bishop pair, and this dark square bishop in particular is very strong, and it's also currently well placed because, very importantly, it's covering the square on d8, which makes it very hard for black to challenge the d line that white already has two pieces controlling. The other problem for black in this position is it's likely that most endgames are going to be not much fun at all for him, because with this queenside majority, strong dark squared bishop, the bishop might be able to come back to e3 at some stage to target the queenside. So he kind of has to look for chances in the middle game, but and play it disruptively. So Karpov actually went rook c8. Well, actually, my game with Tiviakov, I actually played instead queen e5 here. Plays actually a little bit similar in some respects because Karpov played this move later in any event. Tiviakov played queen d2, which is a very important move to defend the bishop, but obviously has the advantage that after queen takes b2, bishop takes h7, wins the queen. And then I continued bishop c6, putting the bishop on a good diagonal. Tiviakov actually went b3 here, which isn't a bad move, just consolidating the queen side. He was slightly better. The game ended in a draw in the end, but I was defending the whole way. It wasn't so pleasant. And actually, I think b4, another idea, which we'll see in the game, with the idea to play b5 to push forward the strong queenside pawns. Well, b5 is already very awkward for the bishop, but also to mobilize quickly white's queenside majority would have given him an even bigger advantage than the move that he played in the game. So, I mean, I wasn't really expecting that we would really get anywhere near this far in this game. When I was preparing, I was looking a lot at earlier divergences, some of the ones we've mentioned, but there are lots of ways the game could have gone differently. So I was pretty happy with this. And another big advantage was that, I mean, obviously I had spent relatively little time because I was playing moves that I was always aware of before. But Karpov had already been thinking quite a lot. I mean, he was traditionally very good in time trouble and sometimes did use quite a lot of time in the opening. But I think this was certainly important later in the game that I had this very big clock lead because the game got quite complicated later in the run up to the time control. But anyway, we won't get ahead of ourselves. We'll just continue. He played, instead of bishop c6, rook a8, targeting the pawn on c4 first. So I defended accurately with rook ac1 here. I mean, b3 here, maybe black can look for counterplay already due to the pinned bishop down this line. So I played rook ac1 instead. The tactics don't really work out for black if he plays queen takes c4, because it might look as though he can take with a knight and target the bishop on g5, but of course the bishop on d7 is also hanging in this variation, so he's just going to end up the exchange down. So it's not possible to take on c4. So instead, he played in similar style to me with Queen E5. Again, the same idea, hitting the bishop and the pawn on B2, and I continued again with Queen D2. Rook takes E4 still doesn't work. It's the same idea. Basically, the bishop on D7 will always be hanging in the end. So he continued with the same move, bishop C6. So I now actually, I'm not sure if I'd actually checked this idea beforehand. I don't think so particularly, but I did continue with B4 in this slightly better way, again threatening to inconvenience the bishop with B5 immediately. And he made a bit of room for the bishop on the long diagonal. B5 is probably a less strong move here. I think it's quite sensible for white to kick the queen back and then to create a protected pass pawn on C5, which could be very useful. Could also be very useful to have access to the D6 square protected by the pawn at some stage. In a dream scenario, maybe I could get a bishop to D6 or possibly a rook at some later stage, particularly if I'm still keeping control of the D8 square. So he played the better B6 because white still has a few loose pawns. And this is quite an interesting position to see how to continue with white. I would quite like to swap queens, but this isn't that easy to achieve. I initially played bishop f4, and he retreated queen f6, but then I was not so satisfied with this development because the drawback to moving the bishop from g5 is, of course, that he's now ready to go one of the rooks to d8 at some later stage, challenging the d file. However, I knew that I did have the option to repeat moves. The queen can't go to b2 because the bishop takes h7. So we went back to e5. Actually, I think that maybe the strongest move here was queen e3. Aiming to swap queens. It would be very desirable for white if I was able to swap queens. Then I've got lots of ways to play on the queen side, either going c5 or possibly just moving my pawn up to a4, a5, weaken the pawn on b6. Maybe later on I can also play b5. I've got lots of useful pawn moves. And it's going to be very hard for him to create any play with the knight in an endgame. The knight is going to be very ineffective, and I don't have to worry about any potential problems with my king with the bishop pointed at this pawn on g2 is always is always a bit problematic in the middle game. But I didn't actually play it. I think I was worried about queen b2, but I thought I was going to have some problems keeping all the pawns on the queen side protected. But in fact, after something like this, it's not so easy for him to start trying to take this pawn. In fact, if he takes on a2, his queen is already getting trapped because he's running out of squares and he can't go to the third rank. Also, this pawn on a7 is hanging. So in fact, queen e3 was really the accurate way to continue here. In this middle game, I think it's actually quite difficult to find the best moves, and although I played quite a few decent moves, I wasn't really able to play the optimal plan in this stage, and he gradually worked his way back into the game. But in the end, I went rook e1, which has the advantage of driving black's queen back, which is desirable. But of course, it's a bit of a concession to move the rook from the very nice square on d1, controlling the d file. So he dropped his queen back to b8. And I continued moving forward on the queen side with a4, just continuing the general plan to advance on the queen side, looking for play there. And it looks quite logical for him to play e5 here. but I think it shows is another variation which shows how the bishops can be quite powerful. The problem with E5 is it immediately gives me the opportunity to drop my bishop onto a very strong square here, hitting the rooks. And you can see already that the rooks are kind of, these bishops are actually controlling a lot of squares, both on these diagonals, making it quite awkward for his rooks already to find good squares. Knight E6 looks quite logical, which I guess would be the idea of E6, E5 to play Knight E6 and perhaps look to bring the knight to D4 later. But something like Rook C3, Rook C7, and in fact here I already have a very dangerous move to play Bishop F6 with the idea that G takes F6, Queen H6, Rook is coming to G3, H7 is hanging. Lots of problems here, and Black's already getting some problems. So you can see that with the bishop pair, Black has to be really quite cautious to not allow my bishop pair too many possibilities. And Karpov looked instead to activate his knight on the king side by playing Knight G6. It was possible maybe to look to drive my bishop back first, but I think he preferred to bring the knight to a safer square first, possibly because he might have been worried about sacrifices after an immediate H6, so bishop takes H6, perhaps. And now Black does have a kind of active plan on the king side, which I was not so comfortable with. It's maybe not impossible to allow, but I was now thinking that he was intending to play a H6. And if I drop the bishop back to E3, then play Knight H4. So I thought that in these circumstances it made sense to block the long diagonal a bit by playing F3. It's a sensible move, but it's not the best move. I think the best move here actually is very hard to see. I don't think I would have come up with the idea without checking it with the computer. But in fact, the computer likes the idea to play H4. And the idea behind this is if Black plays, well, it doesn't actually matter too much whether if he decides to challenge the bishop. If he plays either F6, I just continue with H5. And if it's captured, this pawn on G6 is very awkward for Black. He doesn't really want to leave it there, but there's not so much choice. And the same is if he plays with H6. The same problem. Again, it's really not pleasant to have this pawn on G6. I mean, here it may be even worse because there might be ideas of Queen E3 to H3 and coming down the H file. And if Black was to drop the knight back, then bishop takes H6 looks extremely dangerous again if White takes. And again, there's ideas of Rook E3, Rook G3 coming, and or of course some checks already available. So this was actually the most active move, but I just wasn't really thinking on that side of the board at this precise moment in time. I was focused on consolidating on the king side and developing my advantage on the queen side, and the move was just outside of my line of vision, and also the tactical idea to meet the idea H6 with H5 attacking the knight. So back in the game I played F3, which was another slight misstep. He dropped his bishop back to B7, which targeting the pawn on C4, but this did mean I can now drop my bishop back to B1. Before the bishop on C2 was covering A4, but now his bishop's gone back. It's no longer attacking that pawn. So he now continued by driving back the bishop. There's not actually any possibility to take here because now he can actually defend with Queen F4 here, bringing his queen over to solve any problems on the king side. So I just dropped my bishop back to E3, and now he continued with E5. And this was, I think, also another important moment in the middle game. There are a few options here. I think, again, the strongest move is not that easy. One option I should mention is to take on G6, which makes a bit of a mess of his pawn structure. I didn't really feel that this, although I thought white had some advantage here, which the computer agrees with, I was not really convinced that this was going to be sufficient to win. Black's going to have lots of these, although the structure is not so pretty for black. He has the possibility to put his king on h7, where it'll be very safe with these 3 pawns around. He also might have ideas to play g5, g4 later and kind of undermine this long diagonal where his bishop could be strong. Or he might play g5 followed by e4, or possibly e4 immediately, and some possibilities to bring a rook into d3. So I kind of was hoping to still look for more in this position. The move I played was queen f2, but in fact I should have been more robust and just continued directly c5. The reason I didn't really like it so much was that I thought takes. I could see that he could put his knight to f4, although I didn't see any immediate threats with the knight on f4. I felt just a bit uncomfortable with the knight on f4. But perhaps here it's not such a dangerous thing. White still has plenty of defenders. There aren't any immediate threats, and I can maybe challenge the knight with bishop e3 if need be. And perhaps just continuing with b5, it's not so clear. If he puts a queen on the long diagonal to threaten some sacrifices, I have queen f2. And White's actually in control of the game, but I've really made big progress on the queen side now. I'm getting very close to creating a very strong passed pawn. My bishops are still very powerful and combining well. That was actually, I think, the big move. I was just not urgent enough, and to some extent I actually missed his clever response to queen f2. I was thinking a bit about queen d6. I mean, I was aware he wasn't going to play this move, but I realized it was very convenient if he did, in that I can immediately respond c5, gaining time, and if he captures, I even have a much nicer version of the variation that we were just discussing, because I'm even taking on c5 with gain of time. However, he found a clever way to improve this variation by playing e4. I don't really want to exchange on e4. This would swap off a bishop. I very much want to keep the bishop pair. The 2 bishops here are stronger than just 1 bishop. And also it activates his pieces. The knight can now come into e5. The pawn on c4 no longer looks quite so happy. So that was okay. I had always planned to play f4, which I was not so unhappy with, because I thought, okay, the pawn on e4 blocks the bishop on b7, which is quite good from my point of view. And I'm also covering the e5 square so that it can't be used by his knight. But the problem is now, that after he played queen d6, is that the pawn on b4 is hanging. And now if I was to continue with c5, takes, queen takes f4, my pawn on f4 is hanging. And this creates rather a lot of problems. It's maybe not unplayable for white, but the moves that I really want to play can't be played. The bishop can't move immediately because of the rook on c1's hang. And if I were to take, well, the knight's already possibly jumping into d3. And if I'm taking here, there's already a problem with a fork or on e2 now, or at some later moment. So now I realized I wasn't going to be able to play c5. Possibly the best move here is actually to play b5 here instead, just consolidating the pawns on the queen side. I didn't like in the game so much queen b4, attacking both these pawns on the queen side, but it's possible after bishop a2. In fact, it's not so practical for black to take the pawn on a4. His queen's very much out of the game here, and actually after queen b2 it might even be in some danger of getting trapped. So perhaps that was actually a better idea. But I instead went queen d2, offering the exchange of queens, which, as mentioned, black is in general looking to avoid. And also, so sort of defending the pawn with gain of time in some ways. But he was able to now transfer his queen to f6. And this is a much better position for the black queen on f6 than it was on b8. It's much more dangerous for me. And he's also got some other new possibilities now created in the position. for this black knight that it can maneuver either back to e7 and then to e5, or as he played in the game, even more promisingly, to come to h4 and then either drop back to f5 or possibly to menace some possibilities of knight f3 check if black was going to prepare that with queen g6. But after thinking about the position for some time, I realized that it was not really a situation where I can really prevent black getting active anymore, and that I don't really have complete control of the game. And in fact, that it's just a situation where both sides have to push forward with their own strategic aims. And that although he's going to be able to improve his position on the king side, I have to look to use my strengths on the queen side and push forward my pawns there as quickly as possible to create threats there. So I continued actually. Yeah, I should actually mention after queen c3 here, offering the exchange of queens again, black can actually respond quite well with queen e6, and he still has similar ideas. This doesn't really help white. And there are some moments later on in the game where queen c3 is a useful way to offer the exchange of queens and slow him down. So it's a possibility best kept in hand for later. So I continued with b5, and he continued again with knight h4. Quite a logical idea, planning to bring the knight on f5. If black's able to exchange his knight for my bishop on e3 before I've made progress on the queen side, black's going to be doing at least okay. So I look to push forward quickly there. One problem now is if I look to play c5 and it's captured, I have the problem that if I take with the bishop at some stage, that black will always have possibilities to play e3, and then my pawn on g2 is really vulnerable to both the bishop and knight. So I was looking quite happy to leave my bishop on e3 at the moment, and instead I pushed forward with the other pawn and played a5. So this creates a few threats. For instance, I'm threatening to possibly take, and then target this pawn on b6 with my bishop and queen. But it also creates a strong possibility of playing the pawn up one more square to a6, which would force his bishop into the corner. This may not be completely disastrous, but it looks very ugly to have the bishop on a8 when I've got this chain of pawns from a6 to c4 and the bishop has so little scope. So it's not the kind of place where you would think Karpov would like to put his bishop. So black has to make some decisions here. It's not such a straightforward decision to make. I should perhaps mention if he plays something like queen g6 here, I have the threatening knight f3. It's possible for me to continue with queen f2 with the idea that I can actually take and exchange queens in this way, and it leaves some things hanging on the queen side at the end. So there are a few other options for black. He can just drop the knight back to f5, but as I mentioned, he probably didn't like the line with a6 here. Here, for instance, if black were to play rook d8 to give the bishop a square to retreat to, I can play queen c3, and that's a favourable way for white to exchange queens. Some move like rook d8 is possible, but it's going to enable me to play the queen to f2. It's not clear, perhaps the rook here. Then my queen goes to f2, which is not undesirable from my point of view. And I'm still ready to push forward with c5 or target the pawn on b6. So he just took the pawn. I was aware that it wasn't possible to really capture the pawns on the queen side. If I play queen takes a5, now queen g6 gives me a real problem with threats on g2 and knight f3 check. Again, if I'm playing bishop takes a7, again, the e3 possibility opens up a lot of other nasties against g2. But that wasn't actually my idea, because capturing on a5 has actually given me a pass pawn. And my idea was to push forward this pawn on to c5 with the plan to advance it again next move. And of course, the good news is if I do get the pawn to c6, I'm blunting this bishop on b7, which is taking out a lot of the tactical possibilities that I've mentioned for black over the last few moves. And again, queen g6, this queen f2 idea I mentioned, and knight f3, queen takes f3. And again, this is very, very strong for white, as pawn on a7 is now hanging at the end, and white's going to have a very, very promising ending there. However, he didn't play this. I think in general here, I think he already thought, well, it was clear that the momentum of the game had swung his way in the middle game, and that in the opening he was a bit uncomfortable, and that things were going well. I'm not sure. I think, and he was quite friendly afterwards, and we did have a bit of a post-mortem. And I think he felt actually that black was doing very well here. And I think it's possible that perhaps he was overestimating his position a little bit. But it's a very complicated position. But in fact, it's probably reasonably balanced, or very dynamically balanced. But anyway, I think that may explain partly why he sort of took this pawn and played like this. I think he just felt that it was possible for black to consolidate the extra material. But it's not quite so straightforward as that. I pressed on with c6. I mean, I have to do that. If I play b6, well, then his bishop is still very stable, and he can play something like rook d8, and then he's going to continue with knight f5 next. And these pawns really aren't going anywhere now. The bishop is really dominating. But of course, the problem with going c6, he's forced to drop the bishop back to a8, is that these pawns are not really stable, and black is going to end up a pawn ahead for some foreseeable time. Whether I play something like b takes a6, or well, b6, in fact, he owed me 2 pawns behind if he takes. I mean, b takes a6 doesn't look so bad initially, because it looks quite nice to have the pawn on a7 supported by the bishop on e3. But actually the best move for black is not to grab the pawn immediately. These pawns aren't going to run away. They're too weak to be defended, but to take out the bishop first. And then it starts to seem that I've kind of lost the energy of the pawns on the queen side. So I kind of have to use this temporary advantage that the bishop has been shut out of the game. And a side effect of that is that this pawn on e4 that was very securely defended is actually now a bit vulnerable. So I continued with bishop d4, attacking his queen, and also opening up an attack on the pawn on e4. Things are actually very complicated here. Black has a number of moves that are of roughly equal value. The move that he played is quite decent, but the computer shows some other lines. Queen g6 looks quite tempting initially, with the idea of knight f3 check, but I'm pretty sure the move that he was scared of, which is not the only move, but is to play rook c3, because if knight f3, white can just take. And okay, there's obviously the threat to move the rook over to g3 and hit the pawn on g7. There are a few possible moves for black, but the position is quite dangerous for him. I mean, for instance, a move like knight f5, which looks quite sensible, is actually not very good here. White can continue with bishop e5. This is actually a good move. Bishop takes e4 here is not a good move at all, although it looks quite tempting, because black is able to give up the exchange very profitably. Here he's straightened out his pawns. He's about to regain the pawn on c6. The bishop's going to have a great action along this diagonal. His knight and queen are also very nicely placed here. And all my threats have gone to nothing. The rook g3 idea has disappeared. But white can actually play better with bishop e5, preparing to take with the bishop. And this is actually quite good for white. If he was to play something like f6 here, I have a very handy check. And then I can just take the pawn with the queen, threatening to take the knight on f5. He still hasn't had time to actually start eliminating my queenside pawns yet before things are dropping off here. And if he was to play instead of a takes b5, which looks quite logical, bishop takes e4, and now my two bishops again very strong. Bishop takes c6 looked logical, but now rook g3, again the knight's pinned, and there's going to be big trouble on g7. So it's easy to see why he didn't like the look of this, even if there are some ways for black to calculate his way out of it. Queen d6 is another possible move. It's similar to the one in the game, but he went queen back to d8, probably felt that it was useful to have more protection on his back rank, and perhaps also good that his queen keeps in touch with the knight on h4, which won't be loose in future variations. So, I mean, at this stage, I was probably running a little low on time now, but he'd been quite short of time for a little while in really quite a complicated position. So I think that was probably what sort of helped me in this game. And in fact, that probably the fact that the time advantage I built up in the opening, the fact that the game was very complicated throughout was definitely one of the big factors. But after rook takes e4, I think, I'm not actually sure which move we're on, I think around 37, 38, he actually made the big mistake and probably the decisive mistake in the game. Matters are still far from simple, but black should actually go rook takes e4 first and then take on b5. This position is still very, very complicated. Black has an extra pawn, but I still have very good compensation with the bishops, which are very nicely placed in the center of the board, and my pawn on c6 is quite secure. Queen f2 is a logical move, preparing perhaps bishop b6 ideas, where knight g6 is a logical move. And white has a few options here. f5 is one idea, when black can play the cheeky knight f4 in response, as I can't take it because d4 is hanging. I can also give my bishop a lot of scope with bishop a1, with the idea to move my queen over from f2 to b2, hitting g7, and also the pawn on b5. It's actually roughly balanced. It's quite a complicated position. But he actually captured on b5. So I now actually had a tactical possibility. I don't know if anyone has any suggestions for white here.
Is it going to be some c7 idea?
Yeah, very good. So c7 with the idea just that if he captures, I can capture on e8 and pick up the rook. And this is what happened in the game. He continued queen d7 instead. But this has actually moved my pawn a crucial square further forward. And this will create lots of tactical and positional advantages over the moves to come. So I swapped on e8 now. He captured with the rook. If he captures with the queen, well, there are a few good possibilities for white here. But one quite good possibility is to drop the bishop back to f2, threatening the knight on h4. And although black is able to capture on g2, bishop f5 is very, very strong here. It's actually very hard for black to make any kind of move. He can't actually get any of pieces near to my king. All the key squares are covered, and the rook is on c8 is hanging. Also some threats of moves like queen d7, or even some other possibilities for white. White's not really in a hurry. Black just doesn't have any useful moves. So he took instead with the rook on e8. So So now I made another strong move. I don't know if anyone has a suggestion for a white move here.
Is Queen C2 useful?
Queen C2
Oh,
isn't
no,
good
sorry,
because the
big
bishop is
blunder.
hanging, but you did have the right idea, because I actually played Queen D3.
Okay.
The point of this is that bishop takes E4. I can just take, because if he recaptures, I'm making a new queen. And also, of course, I'm threatening Queen H7 check, and he's not in time with any Queen G4 ideas. I can just mate him with Queen H8 next go. But very importantly as well, it means that my queen is now defended. It's not actually so easy also for him to stop the threat of Queen H7 anyway, given that those two moves that I mentioned aren't possible. So he chose to drop the knight back to G6, which is also a bit of an improvement from my point of view, because it's driven the knight back from its active position. But also now I've got options just to move the bishop to a square of my choice. This was actually, I think we actually had reached the time control at this stage, and it was a fairly slow time control, so a bit more time was welcome at this stage. I mean, if you were turning on the computer at this stage, it will give white very large favourable numbers here, but it's a very complicated position, and I don't think it's very easy to work out what was happening. I was fairly confident that white was doing well and probably winning, but I was far from sure that I would be able to convert the game in such a complicated position. I chose to drop the bishop back to F2. There are other good moves. Bishop B6 is another good move. White doesn't necessarily need the bishop on the king side, but I went bishop F2, which with the idea that if he was to continue something like Queen G4, well, there are lots of good moves here, in fact. Queen H3 is one good move, although it wrecks white's structure. It forces the exchange of queens, but I actually was intending to go bishop G3, which is a very solid defensive place for the bishop, getting ready to look to promote this pawn next and killing off most of the threats he can take on F4, because there's Queen H7 again. So he actually instead went for the endgame, relying on his extra pawn with bishop C6. I was fairly confident that this wasn't good for black, because I felt with the queen swapped, my bishop pair should be very powerful. The pawn on C7 is also extremely powerful, and I'm very close to promoting in a lot of ways, but it's still far from a simple position, because whilst I'm trying to force through the pawn on C7, the pawns on A5 and B5 aren't really that dangerous at the moment, but in 2 or 3 moves they can be, and in fact there are many variations in the future where, although white's winning, there is often only one tempo in it. Anyway, we'll see that as we move forward. I continued with rook d1, the most logical move, because he can't move the bishop because of rook d8, and he dropped the knight back to f8. This is another tricky moment, because bishop c5 looks very tempting here, and actually is a good move. I wasn't able to calculate it to a win. I mean, I was concerned about bishop g4, rook d8, black gives check on e1, king f2, rook takes b1. And no, I wasn't so sure how to win. I could kind of see that if I make a queen here, although white's presumably better, these 2 pawns look quite dangerous. Black might have some options to pin the bishop back against the rook, and I could see these pawns running quite quickly. I wasn't at all sure about converting this. In fact, in this position, the best move for white, which the computer shows, is rook takes f7. I don't think I realised the strength of this move, which is mainly that white's immediately threatening to go f4 to f5, queening immediately, which creates a big problem for black. And, if black was to play a move like bishop e6, white can also play f5 or some such move immediately because I'm making a queen. Rook c1 is the only move which is really sensible, but then white is able to drop the bishop back to d4. This is still not completely straightforward. After something like this, I'm not actually promoting the pawn immediately, but there are a number of problems with the bishop placement and his king, and white should be winning. So perhaps it was another good option for white, but it's not such a straightforward position nonetheless. So I chose instead to play another improving move, but to play f5 to prevent this bishop g4 possibility. I was also very keen to allow the possibility after the move he played rook c8 to play bishop g3 and defend the bishop, defend the pawn from g3. I like the possibility for my bishop to come to d6 or e5 because I thought then it can defend these key diagonals backwards. If his pawns start advancing, I would have the bishop available to cover. There are quite a lot of variations in this game. I think I'm going to cut some of them short because I see the game's actually gone perhaps a little longer than we were expecting already, and there's still a few more variations that I definitely have to show. There are other possibilities for both sides, but most of the moves that we played were pretty reasonable. b4, a4 is another possibility here. Bishop d6, a3. But this is another kind of line where white is winning, but only just. I think I had actually seen these relevant ideas at the board because white actually needs to come up with some quite clever play to win the position. Bishop takes a3 obviously isn't impossible because the rook takes c7. But I can actually win by bishop takes f8, king takes f8, rook takes d7, king e8, which doesn't look so straightforward because now it looks like black is capturing the pawn on c7. But after this, I can capture with my rook on b5, securing the bishop. It looks like black might actually have a clever trick here to go rook c1, king f2, with the idea a2, bishop takes a2, rook c2 check, winning the bishop. But white actually has a finesse here to play rook e5 check, and then after king f8, I can capture with the bishop, and the rook can come back to e2. So these were some of the lines that I was seeing at the board. So it was a funny position. I was definitely calculating very, very hard, and all the lines I was seeing were winning, but I was somehow very nervous because every move, every line seemed to be winning by some very, very small margin. But I think perhaps in the game that Karpov should have looked for more practical tries by kind of pushing the queenside pawns forward quickly, because even if it doesn't work, this seems somehow more scary for white than I think in the game he was perhaps a little bit too slow to do this. In the post-mortem afterwards, actually, he was quite dismissive of his chances at the time control. Maybe for him it was just easy at this stage. He didn't seem to think that he had many chances to save the game, and I think perhaps he could have perhaps created more practical difficulties. Anyway, he played b4, and I continued with bishop d6, again with the idea to capture on f8 and capture on d7. Now he has the problem that after a4, we actually get a variation a bit similar to the last one. Takes, takes, takes. And again, my bishop is protected by the rook. I actually think the most practical move now is for black to play b3. I think this actually would be quite tricky at the board. White should continue bishop e4 with the idea to go bishop b7. So I'm looking to force the rook away. If I actually capture here, then this is maybe not so straightforward in this particular position. So bishop e4, a4, bishop b7 to hit the rook, and now again the variations are quite complicated. He has two options. One is to go rook e8. When I capture, king takes, rook takes d7. Well, this looks incredibly dangerous because of b2. But now white has a very nice move, just bring the bishop back to e4, controlling the queening square. The the rook can't capture on e4 because of the queen, and white's ready just to go rook d8, and then I'm going to be promoting with check before his a-pawn can get anywhere. But again, it's a variation which is extremely close. The other option, which also actually is quite dangerous, is to give up his rook for the pawn immediately and capture on f5, because now his pawns are running. If I play bishop e5, a3 looks quite dangerous. And again, white has to play quite accurately here with the move bishop d5, with the idea that after b2, bishop a2, and I gradually stop his pawns and then bring the bishop back perhaps to d6 and a3 and grab the pawns. They're not actually going anywhere. Perhaps shows one of the main ideas in this endgame, how the bishops are so much stronger than the knight. The knight just doesn't contribute much when it comes to helping to promote these black pawns, which is why I was able to win. But I think b3 would have been certainly a much trickier move. I think I had actually calculated most of those variations okay, but I think they would have been more scary certainly. But he instead chose to redeploy his knight, bringing the knight to h7. I think he can bring it to f6 where it's still defending the bishop on b7. But this actually I was kind of happy to see, and now I actually was getting much more confident that I might actually manage to win the game and get over the line. I continued bishop e4 with the idea to play bishop b7 to drive the rook away. The advantage is then that I would be able to play bishop takes b4 and hit the bishop on d7. He went knight f6. So I continued bishop b7, rook e8. And now I was able to come up with another nice tactical solution, bishop e5, attacking the knight on f6. And if he takes, perhaps he should even do this, rook takes d7. He's actually going to have to lose a rook for this pawn. There's no way to. But he possibly could consider knight takes d7 and try to play this position, hope to get some kind of blockade on the king side. It's clearly not really going to work with the bishop. There's just too much material remaining for it to work. But I still have to take these pawns. His rook is quite well placed. Perhaps he might be able to take this pawn and put his rook on f6 and make it hard for white to win. Perhaps it was one of the options, but okay, it's clearly not a very viable one. Again, if black was to play something like b3, it's actually a rather related variation. Rook takes d7. Well, actually here I can also perhaps even consider dropping the rook back to d1, but bishop e4 is again the simplest way to win, because again, if he captures, I'm promoting with check. So he instead chose to take on f5, but actually now the win is relatively straightforward, as I'm able to play rook d8, and the problem is that I'm threatening to take on f6. I also have the idea of bishop c6, which is going to win large amounts of material. There's no really good way to proceed. I think by now he was also running out of time and probably couldn't put up much further resistance anyway. He went king h7. There are actually a few ways to win here. During the game I wasn't so sure about rook e1 and rook c1, but there's actually a very neat way for white to win here. I just make a queen. I was worried about bishop takes c8 because I thought if I capture then he'll just take the bishop, and although I thought white would be winning, it could be quite technically difficult, but white has a much easier way to win the game here just by going bishop e4 check and giving mate on h8. So that actually would have been quite a nice way to finish the game, but the way I finished the game also wasn't bad. So anyone find my next move here?
Bishop e4.
Bishop e4, very good, with the idea that if bishop takes, I just make a queen. In the game, he went knight takes c7, bishop takes f5 check, g6. But I actually have quite an easy way to win here, which I'd actually already foreseen. I can capture the knight on c7, and now the pawn on a5 is hanging. So he's only left with one queenside pawn, which is easily controlled. And there's not really much hope for black here. The pawns will gradually get picked off as I use Zugzwang. I always have a spare move with the bishop. He continued a few moves, king g6, king f2, king g5, king f3, h5. And my next move caused him to resign. I don't know if anyone wants to call it out. There are lots of good moves
H4.
here, but
H4.
mine is the neatest. Yeah, a very good H4, someone said, with the idea that if he captures, then white has a rather pretty way to end the game. If he goes backwards, then king f4, and black's soon going to run out of moves, and I'm just going to gradually pick off his pawns and win the game quite easily. So yeah, that was the end of the game. I don't know if there's any questions directly about the game, or
I've got a question not about the moves so much, but was that your first win against Karpov? Or
it was my first and only win against Karpov, actually.
How did it feel?
I didn't actually have a terrible score against him, although I did have a minus score. But we did make quite a lot of draws. I actually had quite a lot of good games with him, but yeah, I got to play him quite a few times, and well, who knows, maybe in the future, as I understand he's on the comeback trail, where I think he was actually due to be playing around now, but I think the tournament he was going to be playing on in has been postponed until the end of the year due to the COVID situation. But no, it was very interesting to play with him, and actually very nice. He was always very friendly and very keen to analyse. One year I played against him in a tournament in Dos Hermanos in Seville, and I think he had to play his game on a different day, and I'd agreed to play against him. I think we started a little bit late. We played quite a long game, and we were analysing the game. And I think we were about halfway through the game, and then they actually came downstairs from the restaurant, and they said, "You are going to have to come if you want to have dinner now." So I think you know that if things are too late for dinner in the south of Spain, then that's actually quite late. So yeah, that was. But I think, Karpov, I think he had a good. In general, I think he maybe was a little bit optimistic around the time control, but I think he also correctly felt that I tricked him a bit, which to some extent with this C7 move, he overlooked that I did. But yeah, it was a memorable win for me, certainly, and that's one of the reasons I showed it this evening.
Yeah, very, very interesting game. Somebody's commented what I was thinking, that the power of the two bishops, the knight was dangerous when it went forward, but once it got pushed back again, the bishops in the middle were really powerful.
I think also with the queens, you could see when his queen was on the board and active, that his knight had a lot more possibilities. But in the end game, the knight was just very slow compared to the bishops. And it was interesting how useful my bishops were, not only to promote my own pawn, but also at the same time switching very quickly from that to rush back and stop his pawns in. Quite a few variations, and there were a few others I glossed over at the end because we were getting a bit time pressure to allow a bit of time for other.
Okay, I think we have a question from Paul Sloan.
Yes, Michael or Mickey, I really enjoyed that game. In your column in the Daily Telegraph, you often show a position and then the analysis following the position, which is good, but it means the casual reader has to set up the position and doesn't get the benefit of seeing the opening and what led to that position, which I find a little frustrating. Presumably you do that just because of shortage of space, do you?
Yes, basically. I just feel there's more sort of value-added content from me in terms of the annotations. I know some people would feel that they would prefer to see the entire game, but I sometimes think that maybe a diagram catches people's attentions more, but than perhaps if it's just a game that they won't look at it. But yeah, I understand your point. Yeah. Okay. But I feel sort of the moves are available everywhere, whereas my comments on the game are more what I'm adding. And space is always a bit of a problem. Before I had a newspaper column, I always thought you just kind of submitted annotations to magazines and they sort of magically appear and fit fit the page, but now I understand that this is actually a bit of a process that involves work, and it's very common when you have a newspaper column that you are resizing and deleting or editing, or boards can split, and lots of different things like that. But it is perhaps it's, I might perhaps reconsider that a bit more now. I mean, originally I used to be on the games page, and then the format was a little bit different in that it had a much more larger layout for the moves. But now actually I have the same layout as Malcolm does on the other days. So the moves don't take up as much room. So I may think about that.
I think there's a question from Bob Kane. Are you able to ask your question, Bob? You need to unmute yourself first.
Yes, well, it was the usual question. Mickey, do you have a favourite player from the past that influenced you? And the second part, do you have a favourite book that was an influence on you as a younger player? Thank you.
Well, when I was younger, I suppose the strongest player at that time in Cornwall was Peter Clark, who also had bookstores, and he recommended that I study some of games collections of the world champions, and there was one about Petrosian I remember quite well. I don't know if I still remember that book and quite liked it. I remember spending a lot of time with that book. It wasn't only that. I would say of players that I was lucky enough to play with from the past, Tal and Spassky, to play a couple of tournaments with Tal. Unfortunately, he wasn't around for that long when I was playing, but that was a great experience, and to play with Spassky a few times. That was also very memorable of older players as well. Of course, I've played with all the great modern players like Kasparov and Karpov, as I showed you earlier. So I guess they were quite memorable.
Okay, thanks for that. I think Steve Harley has a question now.
Yes, it's a question that I was going to ask anyway, but actually you mentioned at the end of the Karpov game that it finished very late and you had a late dinner, and I've seen you finish games pretty late in the evening at the London event at Olympia, and I was wondering, how do you wind down after a late finish like that? Particularly if the game hasn't gone the way you wanted. As a very mediocre kind of Division 2 player, if I lose a game on a Tuesday night, I'm beating myself up and can't sleep. How does it work for you?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's any different on the strength of the player. I think when you're disappointed with the result or how you've played, or when you've blundered something silly at the end of a long game, or you just feel you've missed something basic, then or just very disappointed with your play overall, that has just the same effect as it does for everyone else. But I think you probably have the same routine after the game anyway, that you just go back to the hotel and maybe relax for a bit and go out for dinner and try to forget about it. But I think very few players find it genuinely easy to forget about a really bad game and put it behind them. Some guys were better than others. I think maybe someone like Topalov, I thought, was always a guy who was quite good at just being able to put losses completely behind him and come back very, very well. Of course, very strong players often give that impression, but it may just be that they're so strong that even when they're playing a bit below par, that they can come back quite strongly, like Kasparov or Carlsen quite often won the day after a loss.
Okay, I think Mark Payne had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. I know you became an international master at quite a young age, and therefore, presumably, you assumed that you would get to Grandmaster. But I just wondered about, had you always decided that you would be a chess professional, or did you ever have any doubts or concerns that maybe you would need another career choice just in case it didn't work out, or were you convinced from the early age?
Well, actually, the IM title was funny, actually, because at that time I think you needed an all-play-all. And I actually had a few Swiss norms. I had to wait quite a while to actually get a chance at the all-play-all. And I sort of narrowly made it after almost making a mess out of it. I think when I needed 1 out of 2 or something and losing in the penultimate round. Well, I left school at 17. I did start doing my A-levels, but I didn't really continue them. I started off going to the World Junior in Australia at the start of that school year and never really made a very committed attempt to it. So, I think the decision was taken then, but I think I personally had decided really that I felt that I think I'd already known for a few years that was very much the way I was going to go, and I was confident that, I think I had reasonable confidence that I was strong enough. When I was playing with top players, I wasn't so overwhelmed. The first game I played with Karpov, it was a tough game, and I understood I was much weaker, but I wasn't completely wiped out. The first game with Kasparov was a bit of a shocking experience. I was a bit taken aback by how strong Kasparov was. It wasn't only that he crushed me in the game, but when we had a post-mortem, and some of the variations he showed in the post-mortem were really quite shocking to me. That was a big step up. But I was still sort of familiar with other top 10 players. I understood they were stronger than me, but it wasn't... didn't sort of feel that it was some kind of unbridgeable gulf or that I couldn't be competitive with them. So I had I wasn't sure exactly how far I could get, but I had some confidence that I could maybe get to those levels in the future.
Thank you.
I think we one question from Kevin Smythe, and then maybe we return to look at a second game if that's the intention. So Kevin Smythe, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Mickey, in the 90s, you often played openings such as the Trompovsky and the Benko with lots of success. I appreciate why these aren't regularly played at the Super GM level, but is there any reason why you don't tend to wheel them out for surprise value from time to time?
Yeah, I don't think surprise value has so much value now, just because people's opening repertoires are very well organized, and they tend to be on top of most lines they're just quite well prepared everywhere. The benefit of surprise is a bit less than it was. I quite like the Trompovsky when I was playing. It was much less explored, and that was what was more interesting. But now there's much more concrete ways for black to play, which have been well established, that most people are fairly well aware of. The Benko Gambit's sort of an interesting one, because I remember when I sort of started playing the Benko Gambit, and I mainly picked it up because I was reading John Fodorowicz's book. And I remember this book that he was not too impressed by lines where white declined the gambit, and he considered, the test was really very much taking the pawn, which was, much more what we think in modern terms. Of course, that's partly because the computer absolutely hates black's position if white just takes the pawn, and is already giving, huge numbers for white, which I think is another reason people don't like the Benko so much, because it's very depressing to be looking at an opening the computer particularly likes. But at the time when I was playing it, a lot of people just didn't really take the pawn, and I always kind of thought, well, if they're not going to try and hang on to the pawn, this opening looks quite viable to me. I think that the games that put me off were games. I remember I lost a game against Nikolic, and he just took the pawn and played g3, and I never really I also lost a bad game against Olsman. He actually did decline and didn't take the pawn, but I was kind of crushed without much counterplay. So I think it was also sometimes you have negative experiences. And it's not so easy to say to come with something with surprise value. You have to have some ideas, something to show. Just the fact that it comes as a surprise doesn't necessarily isn't that valuable in itself. You need to have some work, some ideas, some improvement, some problems to set your opponent to whatever the opening. And in fact, if you have that in any opening, and if you can find those ideas there, and maybe you can, there probably aren't enough people looking at the Benko, but yeah, I'm not sure that I've cracked it much with modern Layla engines or whatever that think a bit differently. But in general, computers, they like space quite a lot and they like pawns. So if you play the Benko, you have quite a lot of strikes against you right from the start. So you're always looking at, over +1 behind on very early in the game, which I think can be a bit discouraging because it's not so easy to argue with the computer. So there we go. If there are any more questions, I can always go a little bit quicker on the second game. By the way, if you want me to start that, it's just up to you. I don't want to cut off any questions if there are.
Yes, I've got a question. Can I ask it?
Well, hang on. I think Stephen Homer was actually in the queue, James.
Oh, a very quick question, Mickey. What was your training regime to make GM? Did you have like a sort of a methodical training regime that you followed?
No, not too much at that time. I was still at school, so I wasn't playing. I was playing very much in the holidays. So I was just, playing and learning from the top English players, really. I learned a lot from playing weekend tournaments, playing with Mark Hebden, Keith Arkle, a lot of games. I think also talking to those guys socially as well, just in pubs sometimes or post-mortems. I picked up a lot of stuff from them when I was younger. But I don't think my regime didn't change a bit. I was becoming a bit more serious and reading books a bit more. And by then I was maybe getting some foreign magazines with up-to-date games. So I probably had a greater library and I was looking more at that. But it wasn't so different. There wasn't so much emphasis on the opening then. So it was different times. Playing was much more important, and it was quite some time before I really focused on detailed opening preparation. Quite a few.
Kieran Murphy, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. So, Michael, thanks very much for the talk. I've read a couple of anecdotes about your thinking style. So I think one of the anecdotes was in a post-game analysis session where your opponent was showing you lots of variations which you claim not to have seen, but all the ones you showed were always the relevant ones and cut to the heart of the position. And another anecdote about the fact that they suspect that you talk to your pieces and ask them where to go rather than calculating variations. And I was just interested as to what the reality is. How do you go about looking at a position and what sort of thinking styles do you get?
Well, variations do have to be accurate, and long lines don't necessarily help if there are better moves available. But yeah, I don't think that long calculation is a feature of my play or a strong point. Certainly not relative to my strength. I don't know. I'm never really too sure about talking to your pieces and stuff. I think that's more of I don't know. I never found this kind of stuff of much practical use, and I was not so convinced by this kind of thing. I think it's important that you're finding the right lines, and if you are finding good moves and good lines and assessing those accurately, you can choose to not check other lines. But I think sometimes I can calculate quite well. I remember the end of the Karpov game. I think I was very focused and I was calculating quite well. and I think, checking the lines, I was getting things right. But sometimes I think you can calculate. Sometimes you can calculate well when when you're nervous about the position, where you're not absolutely sure you're getting things right. That's sometimes when I can calculate better. But it also depends on the position, of course. Some positions you have to calculate more than others.
Okay.
But in general, I'm not in general looking to head for sharp positions against very many players.
Okay, James, one last question and then we'll move on, I think.
Mickey, can I just ask you, do you have a second name?
No middle name.
You have no middle name. Okay, and where were you born, please?
In Cornwall, in Truro.
You were born in Truro?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. No,
Right.
my parents said it will be a lot easier to fill in forms if you don't have a middle name.
My grandmother was of that opinion. I might add she's dead, actually.
Yeah. Well, okay. Nobody.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. Well, shall we revert to some chess now?
Yeah.
Well, it's all been chess. Sorry. What am I saying?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to show a second game. It's also quite an old game. It's from 1997, from the World Championship tournament in Groningen, which was the big knockout, which I lost in the final of against Anand when he went to play Karpov in the match afterwards. So this was actually the third round. I was actually seeded to the second round, and I'd won one match, and I was actually playing against Tiviakov, who I mentioned earlier that we played the match in New York not long before the Karpov game. So he was a pretty tough opponent for me prior to that match, and that match was also quite competitive. So I don't think we'd played much subsequently, but I was also white in this game. You're seeing a Sicilian, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm white in this game as well. So I played bishop b5 check. So Tiviakov was playing Sicilians with either 2 knight c6 or 2 d6. So against 2 knight c6, bishop b5, he tended to go d6. So he was getting this line very often. I did win one game against him in the match with some nice preparation, but he had obviously looked at it in a bit more detail. So I'll go through the opening stages fairly quickly. I think the end of the game is the most interesting bit of this one. So fairly routine development. In this line, white normally looks to establish a strong center by playing c3 and d4, exploiting the lead in development whilst black gets developed. So I continued with c3. Here drove my bishop back with a6. Bishop a4 is another move here, but I dropped the bishop back to f1. If I was to capture on c6, he recaptures and e4 is hanging. So he took the opportunity to get his bishop out from behind the pawn chain with bishop g4. And I continued d3. This is a fairly well-known line. So white looks to continue with knight bd2. And, well, the main line is actually e6, which is the best move. And white normally continues with knight d2. And later on chases the bishop with h3, g4 ideas. But he actually played a slightly, well, I think it's just a slightly weaker move here, g6. The problem with fianchettoing the bishop here is, I mean, of course, Tiviakov was quite well known as a dragon player, so he quite liked to fianchetto his bishop. But the problem with it here is it leaves the bishop on g4 in a slightly awkward position because it can't drop back to h5 like it could if black had played e6 instead. So I played knight bd2 so that if he does capture on f3 later, I could retake with a knight, which is more convenient. He continued bishop g7. I went h3 to put the question to the bishop. It obviously can't drop back to h5. I actually think he'd be better off playing bishop d7 here, although there's been quite a bit of toing and froing with the pieces. I don't think he should just give up the bishop as lightly as he did in the game. Well, this still looks quite pleasant for white. I'm ready to play d4 now and possibly e5 ideas or d5 ideas. So I think white's doing quite pleasantly here. But I think it was perhaps better than bishop takes f3 as he played in the game. He continued castles because now I was able to go d4, and I was still getting quite a pleasant central control. But I've also managed to keep the bishop pair, which turned out to be quite useful later on. So he captured on d4, quite logical. I retook. There are a few possible moves here. I was thinking perhaps it was maybe better for him to go queen b6. The computer tends to like ideas with d5 here, which is certainly has its points, but I was slightly reluctant to play with d5 if I could avoid it. I didn't really want to open up this bishop up and give it a lot of range. It just seemed much more practical for me to try and keep a barrier down that diagonal, if at all possible. So he went rook c8, and I was able to go queen b3 instead. I mean, d5 here, the computer quite likes d5 and just says his knight's getting kicked around and the white's doing well here. But I was thinking some position like this was maybe not so practical. His knight will jump back around, perhaps from a6 to c5. And this bishop does have a bit of scope. I wasn't so sure about lines like this. I think white has to be a lot more precise. It seemed to me much better just to try and keep these pawns solidly protected, carry on developing and gradually probe and to sort of keep control of the game. Queen b3 also attacks the pawn on b7, which is useful. It's not so clear how to remove it, play it. Something like queen c7 is possible, but then I could continue just developing my bishop somewhere. Just a d2 is okay. And then, of course, I have the opportunity to go rook c1, and there's a pin down the c file. So looks quite pleasant for white. He could play knight a5, but queen b4, still not clear that there's any particularly good follow-up. He can't really attack my queen again. So he actually went rook c7, which is not so unreasonable. He might hope to double rooks on the c file later on, but in some ways it's perhaps a little bit awkward. And I was able to, it's possible to play e5 here. It's another possible way for white to proceed, with the idea to maybe look to exploit his weak light squares immediately, as I have my light square bishop and he doesn't. But I was kind of very reluctant to do something like this, just because I don't really have that much development. I didn't really want things happening until I'd got my pieces out. So I was very happy with the way I played in the game, just bishop f4, and freeing the way for my rook to come out. He continued knight d7, attacking my pawn on d4, but now I was just able to play rook a d1, just keeping everything secure. And he continued with queen b8. He could maybe try some other options. Something like knight takes d4 was maybe worth a try, to try and break out, as he's lacking in space. But I wasn't really convinced by this. I think that white is a bit better here. e5 is quite strong. My bishop might come back out to c4 at some moment, attack the pawn on f7. My queen could maybe go in towards d5, or maybe across here to attack the pawn on f4. I think white has some advantages, and e6 is also a possibility. So instead he played queen b8. So I actually played a move I quite liked. I think quite a good positional move here. I might take some more suggestions if anyone wants to put one forward.
Is E5 playable?
Yeah, E5 is playable. I wasn't so sure about it because if I take like this, I was thinking that his knight would get a square on E6, which I wasn't so sure about, to maybe give his knight a kind of solid idea. Or possibly also, maybe it may be possible also to maybe just blockade. He's got quite a lot of pieces attacking this pawn on E5. And it's not so clear actually here what my light squared bishop will end up doing in a position like this. So I was less inclined to release the tension so early. I was more interested in trying to keep keep the options and look for a very favourable moment to make a move that committal.
Would you play a4 to just gain space on the queen side?
No, I didn't actually play a4. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think the move I played had a similar idea, in fact, to gain space, but I think it was just a bit more concrete. I actually played h4 with a few ideas. I would be quite happy if given the opportunity just to play h5. He doesn't really want to take that, and maybe then I could put the pawn to h6. But it also has another idea, which we'll see later, which is just to continue later on, possibly by playing g3 and give the bishop some space on h3. But we'll see that idea come in later. But it's mainly, I think, the move to play h5. I mean, the fact that his knight isn't on f6, it's a little bit awkward. He doesn't really want to bring the knight back to f6. h5 looks like maybe it gives a bit more of a weakness. Maybe then it might be more profitable for white to play something like queen e3 and bishop h6, for instance, or the square on g5 will be available for my knight in the future. So h6 looks again looks as though it's creating some weaknesses on the king's side. So it's not so easy for him to meet this. So he decided to take he could also play knight takes d4 here. It's a bit similar to the previous line, but white has a few other options. For instance, here it might even be possible to play a move like queen g3 with the idea he takes d4, bishop takes d6 is very strong. So he instead played e5. So this kind of gives him a bit of dark square control and a bit of space in the center. But after I captured and dropped the bishop back to e3 to prevent knight d4 and also controlling knight c5. Now, of course, black's got the problem that unlike the lines I was mentioning earlier, where the bishop had a lot of scope along the diagonal, now it's really blocked in by this pawn on e5. And also, long term, this gives me some more possibilities for my bishop. Now that he can't block this diagonal with e6, the bishop might have a possibility to come back to c4 and into d5. I can't do this immediately because of knight a5 tactic, but it's another possibility opening up for my bishop on f1. My bishop on e3 is also fairly comfortable. So he tried to bring his queen back into the game. It wasn't doing much on b8, particularly now it's blocked by this pawn on e5. I played the move queen a3. There's a few other options, but queen a3 I quite liked because I thought maybe I'm ready to go bishop c4 in the future. I've taken out the knight a5 idea and could look to put the bishop to d5. And I've also got ideas maybe to play a later rook d6 or even queen d6 here. Could be a tricky problem attacking the rook, and which is tied to the defense of the knight. So he took the decision to swap queens, which is fairly logical. It gives his rook space along the his rook on f8 some more room, and his queen is certainly less active than mine. So we swapped queens here. So I might ask for a suggestion here for white's next move again.
Rook d6.
Sorry, what was that?
Rook d6.
Rook d6. Yeah, I actually played g3 first. I quite like g3 here because if he plays like rook c8, my bishop is very, very powerfully placed along this diagonal, just really hitting everything along here. It's very nice to have control of this, and also to give my bishop another idea. I actually played rook d6 in a minute, but I'm not sure it was actually the best move there even. But I think actually activating this bishop is actually more important and trying to bring all my pieces into the game and target his weakened light squares. And he actually responded to g3 with h6. The problem is I think he was looking to play ideas with f5 here, but a common problem is if he plays some move like this, well, there's lots of possibilities, but one of the problems is my knight could jump into g5 and threaten to jump into e6 I've also got ideas of h5 here, but there's just a general problem that there are lots of lines where knight g5 ideas are a problem for him. So he chose to play h6, but of course this gives him some other problems on the light squares and light square control. I actually think I would probably be better just to continue with bishop h3 here, just targeting the knight, because there are still lots of actual problems. f5, just looking to try and weaken these squares. Playing something like this, white gets very active. Now that I've actually weakened his structure a bit, the rook coming into d6 is much stronger, attacking the pawn on h6. But actually, my next move actually wasn't so good, because I played rook d6, because I'd seen that he would probably play knight c8 and kick my rook back, but I thought, well, his knight is so badly placed on c8 that won't really matter, and I can just play rook d2, and I didn't see such a useful move for him here. But actually here I'd missed that he can play knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and knight takes e5 I can't play because of knight takes e4. And I think I'd perhaps been thinking that I would just defend it with bishop d3. But then, of course, the knight can jump off the back rank. And suddenly, actually, black's not doing at all badly. Because actually this knight can maybe even jump to c4. There's also some threats to the pawn on e4. And his pieces have actually started to get a bit of activity and harmony. So this was actually a tricky moment in the game, but I actually managed to recover quite well and find a good move. It's actually quite a strange move because I actually make 3 moves in a row and I actually end up in exactly the same position that I had before. I actually moved the rook back 1 square to d1. But despite the fact that I haven't really achieved very much, he's actually probably achieved even less because this knight is sort of stuck on c8 and the pawn on e5 is also hanging. So it's not really clear exactly that this has been so favourable from him and I'm able to consolidate a bit without letting him get too active. So he took on e4. I think probably felt under some pressure and wanted to try and change the structure. It's maybe possible to continue with something like rook e8. But okay, white's continuing to keep some pleasant advantage with perhaps a move like bishop d2, looking to come around to c3 or a5, b4, lots of squares for the bishop, and I can defend the pawn on e4 with bishop d3 if required. Or maybe the bishop can come to h3 at a favourable moment. Still, perhaps that was a better idea, but he kind of went for the opportunity to change the material balance. So in order to get the pawn back, I have to actually give up the bishop pair at this stage. He can't take on f2 after bishop takes g7. He's going to end up material behind. But we actually now reach a opposite colour bishop position. And perhaps the rest of the game is more of a colour complex situation rather than perhaps the situation of the bishop. I mean, his next move was very ugly and definitely bad. I think this plan to play knight takes e4 was not bad, but he absolutely have to continue with bishop g7 here. I mean, it's actually not good for me to take on e5 anyway. He can pin the knight on e5 and his other rook can also maybe come over to put more pressure. And white's not losing material, but it's not a good idea. I mean, white still actually has a better position. If I just continue quietly, I can just make a very simple move like king g2, as now my bishop's probably going to come to c4. I could also maybe play bishop c4 immediately, which kind of creates a pin down this diagonal, which is useful to prevent f5. White still has a bit of pressure, but it's certainly a possible way for black to play, and it was definitely better. So he actually played f6. I think he figured it's not such a bad move on the grounds that he consolidates the pawn on e5. His bishop is actually still reasonably active on this diagonal. It's not completely out of play on g7 anymore. But I mean, now actually his light squares are looking particularly weak, and actually his position went downhill very, very quickly from this moment. So I played rook c4, which is actually rather a strong move, because here's the problem that it's very hard for him to respond to this, because if he takes, he can't really go king g7 because of rook d7 check. And after king h8, well, there's actually a recurring idea in the position to play h5, with the idea that my knight starts to jump in on all these loose squares on the king side, to play knight g6 or knight f5. The rook coming in, this is really very dangerous for black, and this is sort of a recurring problem for him. But it's also kind of a problem. I mean, he played rook e7. I mean, if we consider another move like rook g7, then he's kind of hit by problems with the other side of the board. We can see this h3 square that I freed up earlier with these g3, h4 ideas, giving this bishop an ever extra option. Turns out to be very convenient to play bishop h3. F5 he can't play here because e5 is hanging. But actually then you start to see this knight has some serious issues in any case. I mean, if he comes knight b6, which looks quite logical, rook b4, turns out the knight is actually getting really short of spaces to go to. I mean, it's now considering whether to go back to c8 or a8, which is really not looking particularly promising. Knight a7, there are also lots of ideas. My rook can come into d6, bishop e6 ideas. Also more ideas with h5 followed by knight h4. So he actually went to another square, rook e7. And I continued again with the h5 idea. In fact, this wasn't actually the most accurate move, although it's quite hard to actually see why. In fact, it's actually more accurate to go h5 first here, rather than to continue with bishop h3 as was played in the game. So, sorry, I'm getting confused. It was actually bishop h3 here that was slightly more accurate. So the game, I've confused you there. Just to continue, so the game actually continued h5, g takes h5, if g5, bishop h3, hitting the knight on c8 again creates a really big problem for him. If f5, I can just take the pawn because the knight is hanging in any event. If he continues knight b6, rook b4, and all the captures work out for me because the bishop on h6 is hanging. So instead he captured, and I went knight h4. Actually, bishop h3 was somewhat more accurate, as we will see, with very similar ideas to the game of going knight h4 next. I mean, I thought knight h4 was just winning, but actually then when I was thinking about his reply, I realized he actually had quite a clever defense here to play b5. I mean, I thought this was no good because of rook c6. I thought pawn on a6 is hanging. Then the pawn on b5 will be hanging. Knight f5 is threatened. Knight g6 looks absolutely hopeless. I couldn't really see any ideas for black at all here. But actually he has a rather clever defense to go rook a7. And if I play either knight g6 or knight f5, he can then actually play knight e7. And here if I take, then he can actually regain the knight and restore a little bit of order to his position. This is still very good for white. I mean, there are various ways that white can play. I don't have to play rook c6. I can possibly move the rook back to c2. But this b5 move would definitely have given him a few chances to fight and given him a little bit of room in the position. He actually just played rook h7 instead. But now everything is really running like clockwork for me. It's just the whole position is really horrendous because now bishop h3. And now you can really see the weak light squares on the king side are just horrible. These squares on e6 and g6. The knight is threatened immediately. If he plays some continuation like this, there's a problem that this check on e6, he's got no good way to meet it. King h8, there's knight g6, king g7. well, there's rook d7, rook takes b7, knight f5. There's just so many. Everything is collapsing around him. So he moved the knight to e7, quite logically. At least it covers the squares, but it doesn't really help so much. I put in the check and continued rook c7. And, it's really ugly position for black now. If he plays knight g8, that would have been quite a nice finish. But there's just nothing much to be done at all. White's threatening immediately rook takes e7 to win a piece. He played f5. There's nothing really much better here. I was able to bring another rook down onto the 7th rank. He defended the knight, but it doesn't really help. Knight takes g6 is another nice finish. So he just played king g. Oops. I think he resigned there. I think after knight g6. But if he does continue king g7, something like this, it doesn't really change much. I can even just move the bishop back, knight d5 check, or rook d6, and many things threatened. And white is, of course, already a piece up. So a totally resignable position. So we didn't have so much time in that game, but I thought it was perhaps another game which showed in some way the powers of the bishops, and sometimes when you have the bishop pair, that one of the advantages is sometimes it can get cached in a way that you get other advantages. Because when he was encouraged into the f6 concession, it left him with really weak light squares, and then the position fell apart quite quickly. So I think we're coming up to a roundabout time we were due to finish. So I don't know if there are any more questions on that game or anything else.
Yeah,
I think I'll leave it there if there's
a quick question or two on this game, and then we'll wrap up.
Great.
Any questions on this one? No? Okay. All right. Well, I think it remains for me on behalf of Camberley Chess Club to, first of all, thank everyone for attending, and in particular to thank you, Michael, for a very interesting couple of games, very instructive. I found it very, very clear, actually, your explanations in quite complex positions, especially the first game. When it got into the middle game, it got very complicated. But for me, you explained it very well, and I enjoyed both games immensely. And hopefully you enjoyed some of the questions in the middle.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been enjoyable, and I'm happy if, particularly with the first game, which I was worried was quite complicated. So I hope I was able to give enough general instruction, but obviously it was quite a long game and a lot of variation. So it's difficult to get the balance right, but I'm glad.
No, I think
that it worked for you.
did. I think you got the balance very, very well, and lots of people are chatting with comments. I think everybody was extremely pleased with everything. So thank you very much again. And if you would like to join us again in the future, you'd obviously be very welcome. We've just for everybody's benefit, we've got some other good sessions coming up. Keep your eye on the events page. We've got another Grandmaster coming up actually in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, and so obviously keep on that. We do, as mentioned, record these. We'll do a quick edit, and we do actually put that on the website as well on the videos page. So unless anyone's got anything else, I'd like to finally thank you again, Michael.
Can I ask everyone to show their appreciation, please?
Unmute first.
Yeah, well.
like I did unmute earlier.
All right, thank you very much.